Then they'd have to go in and remove all the animals. Can you imagine how they would do that? The fish, the birds, the snakes, the alligators. Then they would have to remove all the vegetation and ultimately remove the top half-inch of soil, because everything would be radioactively contaminated for thousands of years. They would have essentially created a nuclear wasteland.
A couple of years ago, NASA had a launch accident at the Cape, the Delta rocket. The toxic material from that was in my community within an hour or so, and no one knew what was happening, only that there was breathing problems in the air. When I called emergency management in my local county office, there was no information. That emergency management office had no information about what was on that rocket, whether there was nuclear material released, and there was absolutely no time, there was no warning, no one had any time, and people were getting respiratory problems from this cloud that was hovering over our town. They have absolutely no plans to protect us from any kind of nuclear explosion at the Cape, and I'm very, very concerned for my community.
And so that's why this nuclear systems initiative of the Bush administration is so dangerous, because they're now contemplating a dramatic expansion, dramatic escalation of the numbers of launches. It's like playing Russian roulette, putting a bullet in the chamber and pulling the trigger. Eventually, one of them is going to go off.
I mean, the militarization of space is a real threat to survival, serious threat to survival. That's why the whole world is strongly against it. I mean, ever since there is a 1967 Outer Space Treaty, which limits the use of space, it tries to limit the use of space to peaceful purposes. And the last few years, it has been understood around the world that the United States is going to violate it. So there have been efforts at the United Nations, at the UN Disarmament Commission, and elsewhere to try to put some teeth in the Outer Space Treaty, make it put enforcement mechanisms which will prevent the militarization of space, and the U.S. has just been blocking them.
Well, after Cassini was launched, it went out around Venus and whipped around Venus, and then came hurtling back to Earth. And it was going to do what's called an Earth flyby, use the gravity of Earth to sling it on out into deep space. Originally, they were going to come in at about 125 miles off the surface of the Earth. And the fear was that the Earth's gravity could pull it in. And if there was a misfire of its rockets, which in the laboratory had a 10% failure rate, by the way, it could have then burned up on reentry, spread 72 pounds of plutonium globally. It only takes 1 pound of plutonium to essentially give everybody on the Earth a lethal dose. But anyway, because of our protests prior to the launch, NASA moved it out 250 miles. And then prior to the slingshot that came around in 1999, they moved it out to about 500 miles. So that as it did its maneuver, its flyby maneuver of the Earth, there was a lot less likely chance that it was going to fall into the Earth's gravity and be sucked in. This was a major victory for us, actually. Not very well reported in the media, but we forced NASA to move Cassini hundreds of miles farther from the Earth as they did that flyby. Fortunately, the Cassini flyby went without any problem, and it's now going out into deep space on its mission. NASA says that they have to use nuclear power on these interplanetary probes because they're going too far from the sun, that solar won't work in deep space, and so therefore they have no other choice but to use nuclear power. But it's interesting because the European Space Agency is doing a mission called Rosetta that is going way out into deep, dark space, and they're using solar power. They've developed high-efficiency solar cells for deep space missions because they don't rely on nuclear power. They don't have a nuclear industry that is controlling the planning process within the European Space Agency. In the last 10 years, NASA's budget has been cut by about 40%. And this has turned NASA to go to the Pentagon, whose budget has been growing all the time. NASA now is saying to the Pentagon, okay, everything we do from now on will be dual use, meaning every mission we do will be carrying military and civilian payloads. We know that the recent Columbia shuttle accident had on board 3 military missions. We were told by the media that they were just studying bugs and moss on board, but in fact they had 3 military missions, including Star Wars planning missions. And so again, the weapons corporations have taken over the space program, and they're hiding behind it, using it in order to go out and create these new testing programs for Star Wars, because they don't want the American people to understand the depth of the plans for moving the arms race into the heavens. I call it pyramids to the heavens. The aerospace corporations are the new pharaohs of our age, building these pyramids to the heavens, and we, the taxpayers, will be the slaves. We'll turn over our education. We'll turn over our health care. We'll turn over our children's future and get very little in return, just like the slaves at the time of the pharaohs. You know, we know there are so many plans that are underway now for space technologies that are secret. There's a whole thing called the black budget, where even the Congress of the United States doesn't even know about these secret programs underway. So we're just scratching the surface here with what we understand. But clearly what we understand is frightening, and what we don't know should be even more frightening to us. And in the end, we're told all of this is being done in order to make our lives more secure. But the truth of the matter is, our lives are becoming more insecure because of all these programs and plans. We're making the world more unstable. We're creating more enemies around the world. We're creating new arms races. We're draining the treasury, taking money out of protecting our children's future. All of this is going to make our lives more insecure. We know that the Bush administration and their corporate allies are going to do everything they can to restrict civil liberties as opposition builds to their plans for this corporate domination. We saw in New York City, when there was big demonstrations there recently, that the police wouldn't allow the people to even have a march permit. And they began, as people arrived to just attend a rally, they tried to push them away, not allowing them even to come to that. We're seeing more and more of these intrusions into our civil liberties around the country. And so I think this is going to be something that we're going to see more of. Well, just as the corporations have taken control of our government, they've also taken control of the media. The media is now dominated by just literally a handful of multinational corporations. For example, the Chicago Tribune brags that on a given day, 80% of the American people get their information from a Chicago Tribune product, whether it's television, newspaper, internet, radio. And in fact, Secretary of War Donald Rumsfeld was on the board of directors of the Chicago Tribune before Bush appointed him to his current post. So what we have now is these interlocking boards of directorates. The weapons corporations, the pharmaceutical corporations, the banking corporations, the nuclear energy corporations, and the media corporations. It's all the same people. And that's who we're dealing with here in the world today. You know, the United States justifies our war in Afghanistan and then the war in Iraq as a response to the terrorists. But what we have done is we have become a terrorist nation, just as the terrorists themselves have done. We must acknowledge that today our Congress is essentially under the control of the multinational corporations. You know, when former President Eisenhower, a World War II general, left office in January of 1961, in his concluding speech to the American people, he warned us to beware of the power of the military-industrial complex. He said they were gaining undue influence in the halls of the Congress. And I'm afraid General Eisenhower, President Eisenhower's warning to us has come true.